Hello everyone, welcome to the Adkup Show. The world needs Africa's resources, but not necessarily a developed Africa. That's the brutal truth behind decades of policies, assistance programs, and promises. Africa's underdevelopment isn't a coincidence. It's a system designed to keep it exactly where it is. Rich in resources, but poor in power and prosperity. Let's break down the real reasons behind why it is like that. So, Africa's economic system was never designed to build, but only to extract. This story starts with the very foundation of Africa's economy. It's built on a colonial blueprint that never truly went away. During colonial rule, infrastructure was built only to connect mines and plantations to ports, not to connect African markets with each other. Railways led outwards, never inwards. This created a chaos and vacuum within the continent which is not filled yet. Even after independence, most African economies stayed trapped in that pattern, export raw materials and import finished goods. Today, over 75% of Africa's exports are still raw commodities. Oil from Nigeria, cobalt from Congo, gold from Ghana, and coffee from Ethiopia. Meanwhile, it imports almost everything else, from clothing to machinery to even basic food products. By the way, almost 90% food which Africa consumes is imported, and it's estimated that food import bills could cross $100 billion this year. This creates a structural imbalance. Africa generates wealth, but it doesn't retain it. When cocoa beans are exported from Ivory Coast at $2,000 a ton and Swiss chocolate made from the same cocoa sells at $20,000 a ton, then it's clear who is winning in this game. This isn't just unfair trade, it's structural dependency. The colonial economic logic of Africa produces and the West processes still defines the global supply chain today. This economic imbalance ties directly into another layer of control, the debt trap. Africa's richest countries in natural resources are also some of the poorest in cash. That's because the continent is caught in a debt trap. Much of it is denominated in US dollar. This means Africa's financial system is tightly controlled by Western powers. According to the World Bank, African nations owe over $850 billion in external debt. In 2022 alone, they paid $68 billion just in interest. That's money that could have built power plants, universities, or railways. Every time the US Federal Reserve raises interest rates, Africa's debt burden grows heavier because their currency weakens against the dollar. And when the dollar rises, imports from fuel to medicines become more expensive. Inflation spikes and governments borrow more to stabilize their economies. It's a vicious loop. Even worse, many loans from international institutions like the IMF or World Bank comes with conditions like cut subsidies, privatize industries, and liberalize trade. These structural adjustment programs often kill local industries before they even mature. So instead of building domestic manufacturing, African countries end up opening their markets to cheap imports, deepening dependence rather than development. The global financial system is anti-Africa. This financial dependency doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's compounded by political fragility rooted in history. Africa's political map was drawn in European boardrooms, not by its people. The Berlin Conference of 1884 carved the continent into pieces, merging rivals and dividing communities. The result of that was over 10,000 ethnic groups compressed into 54 countries, many with fragile unity and chronic instability. What makes the situation even worse is that out of that 54 countries, 16 are landlocked. That's why Africa sees more coups than any other continent. Between 2000 and 2024, there were more than 40 attempted or successful coups from Mali and Burkina Faso to Sudan and Niger. Each power struggles resets the development. Investors flee, infrastructure projects stall, and years of progress vanish overnight. And corruption, which is often cited as an African problem, isn't a cultural issue, it's systematic. When the economy depends on foreign assistance and resource rents, politics becomes a competition over who controls the external money, not who builds the internal productivity. Without strong institutions like courts and auditors, it's impossible to ensure accountability or attract serious industrial investments. This political instability leads us to another major hurdle. Why can't Africa just industrialize? A lot of people think, why doesn't Africa just start manufacturing? At least the region which are relatively stable can start manufacturing, which might just lead to trickle-down effect. The answer to that is that world doesn't need another factory continent. When Asia industrialized, the global demand for cheap manufacturing was booming. But now global supply chains are saturated and China, Vietnam, and Bangladesh dominate low-cost production. A factory in Kenya or Nigeria simply can't compete with a Chinese plant that produces goods cheaper, faster, and with better logistics. Even Ethiopia, once hailed as the next manufacturing hub, struggled. Its Hawassa Industrial Park, one of Asia's largest, created 25,000 jobs, but global brands later pulled out because of rising costs, logistic issues, and war in Tigray. So here's the cruel irony. When African nations try to protect local industries through tariffs or subsidies, the IMF or WTO often pressures them to liberalize. Meanwhile, Western and Chinese economies protect their own industries heavily. It's a double standard that keeps Africa as a consumer, not a producer. Africa is a weak continent which has no united voice, so it becomes very easy for foreign powers to enforce whatever they want on Africa. This inability to industrialize connects directly to Africa's so-called resource curse. Africa holds 30% of world's mineral reserves, 60% of its arable land, and 65% of global cobalt reserves, essential for electric vehicle batteries. Yet this wealth rarely benefits the people living on it. This is the resource curse where natural abundance fuels corruption, foreign meddling, and inequality. Multinational corporations often control extraction through opaque contracts. In Congo, cobalt mining profits flow through Swiss trading companies and Chinese refineries, while miners earn less than $2 a day. Foreign powers also shape internal politics to protect their interests. France has historically used its franc CFA currency system to control monetary policy in 14 African countries. China, through its Belt and Road Initiative, has built roads, ports, and power plants, but often using Chinese laborers, Chinese material, and Chinese loans. So even as infrastructure grows, Africa rarely gains the technology transfer or industrial ecosystem needed for long-term development. This lack of technology transfer brings us to another critical issue: education and skills. Africa has the youngest population in the world, with median age of just 19. That's nearly half of Europe's median age. On paper, that's a demographic advantage, but in reality, it's a ticking time bomb. Each year, about 12 million young Africans enter the labor market, but only 3 million jobs are created. Without factories or innovation hubs, millions remain unemployment or migrate. Moreover, the majority of these 3 million jobs aren't really good enough to establish a stable middle class. The education system is part of the problem. Many countries still follow colonial-era syllabuses focused on theory and civil service exams, not science, engineering, or entrepreneurship. So when industrial parks or tech zones are built, they often need foreign managers and engineers, because domestic technical skills are limited, and without a strong innovative ecosystem, Africa struggles to move up the value chain. The struggle to innovate is made even harder by a global trade system stacked up against Africa. When Western nations preach free trade, what they really mean is open your markets but don't touch ours. African farmers can't compete with heavily subsidized European or American agriculture. For example, US cotton subsidies amount for over $3 billion a year, which makes it impossible for African cotton producers to sell competitively. Similarly, European milk producers flood West Africa at prices local dairy farmers can't match. The WTO rules sound fair, but in reality, it's asymmetric. African countries are told to remove tariffs, but when they try to process raw goods, like roasting coffee or refining oil, they face tariffs on finished products when exporting to Western markets. That's how Africa remains stuck as supplier of cheap raw materials, not a manufacturer of valuable products. This trade imbalance feeds into a broader demographic challenge. By 2050, Africa's population will reach 2.5 billion, with one-third of global youth living in there. Cities like Lagos and Nairobi are growing faster than their infrastructure can handle. But urbanization without industrialization only creates megacities of unemployment. Power shortages, poor transport, and weak institutions make it hard for private enterprises to thrive. Nigeria, which is Africa's most populated country, generates less electricity than New York City for over 200 million people. Without major investments in energy, education, and governance, the so-called demographic dividend could easily turn into mass discontent, fueling instability, migration, and extremism. And in Africa's case, it could lead to humanitarian crisis where its population declines and continent further slips into darkness. This potential for crisis is worsened by a socio-political trap. Even after independence, Africa's power structure didn't truly change, only face did. Colonial administrators were replaced by local elites who often maintained the same extractive systems. The state becomes a tool for rent-seeking, not nation-building. Many leaders found it easier to rely on foreign loans and resource deals than to develop a domestic tax base or industrial policy. So while countries like South Korea or Malaysia build strong bureaucracies and export industries, African nations got stuck managing aid flows and commodity contracts. This elite continuity, backed by foreign powers who prefer stability over reforms, have kept most countries locked in low productivity and high inequality. All these factors, from economic dependency to political fragility to trade imbalances, connect to form a larger picture. The global economic system is structured so that Africa's role remains that of a supplier of minerals like raw materials and cheap labor. Every time Africa tries to climb up the value chain, the system resists. When Zambia tried to nationalize copper in 1970s, Western firms pulled out and IMF cut support. When Ghana tried to process cocoa locally, it faced higher tariffs on exports. When Ethiopia built state-led industries, it was punished with sanctions after a civil conflict. Even aid, which is often framed as generosity, is not really a generosity. It's used for influencing votes at the United Nations, securing resource access, or pushing specific policies. So can Africa really develop? The answer is yes, but not under the system. To do so, it would need to break dollar dependence and create regional payment systems like the new Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, which is very dangerous as America would see it as a threat to its dollar dominance. We know what happened to Thomas Sankara and Muammar Gaddafi when they tried to establish their own system. Then build value chains within Africa, turning raw materials, crops, and energy into finished goods at home. Invest in education and energy, not just infrastructure. And most importantly, reform governance, making leaders accountable for citizens, not donors. But these are political choices, and they challenge global power, because a truly developed Africa would mean a shift in the global order, from resource dependence to partnership. Until then, Africa will remain what it was made to be, the engine of other people's prosperity. So the conclusion is that Africa will probably never develop under the current world order. And if the current world order falls, then Africa will be in a bigger trouble as it won't get any support from outside. If you found this analysis insightful, then like, share, and subscribe. What do you think will be Africa's future? Prosperity or poverty? Let's keep the conversation going in the comment section. I'll see you in the next video. Peace out.